Good evening, everyone. Historic Preservation Commission, April 24th, 2023. It's just a little bit after 6 o'clock. In compliance with the Open Public Meeting Act of 1975, adequate notice of this meeting has been provided. If any member has reason to believe this meeting is being held in violation of that act, they should state so at this time. Pledge allegiance, please. I pledge
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Copeland?
Here.
Mr. Carroll?
Here.
Ms. Campbell? Here. Mr. Cogswell?
Here.
Ms. Pisagno?
Here.
Ms. Wilson-Stradick?
Here.
Mr. Testa?
Here.
Mr. Stevenson is absent. Mr. Becker?
Here.
Thank you.
This evening is a special presentation. We're not considering applications. It's a presentation to update the Historic Preservation Commission design standards, which the city has received a grant to update. Our current design standards are award-winning and really have served us very well, but they're over 20 years old, and it's time for an update. We have received a grant, and I've asked Pip Campbell to head up this project, and I would turn the meeting over to Pip to introduce our guest consultant and go from there.
Okay.
Pip?
Yes, thank you. So we began last year, we have a committee that includes some people on the HPC, some people from the community, and a variety of other kinds of experts that are on this committee. So the committee has been meeting with Stephen, who I will introduce in just a bit, over, I think since maybe September, October, something like that, in looking through the present design standards and in making recommendations for what might be included or how things might be framed a little bit differently for the new design standards. So it's Stephen's job tonight to present these design standards to everybody on the HPC and those of you in the audience. That's great that people came, and to be able to share them. So I'd like to introduce Stephen Smolin, right over here, right in the front, who is our computer expert. Now, he's a whiz at presentations, and he's done a great job so far on these standards. And one of the things that I think he has oriented his work to is to make sure that our standards remain award-winning. They're going to be award-winning next year again, and to make sure that they remain award-winning, but most importantly, to make sure that they reflect the perspectives of the Secretary of the Interior standards, of our own standards in Cape May, and most importantly, what is critical and important to people in the community. So with that, Stephen, I didn't mention he's an architect. All right.
Helps. Well, thank you, Pip, and the rest of the
Pull
commission.
the mic closer to you, please.
Thank you all for accommodating this special meeting tonight to go over the design standards project. As Pip mentioned, I've been working with her subcommittee since late February. We've met twice so far, and they've had an opportunity to look at this draft, which is only the text, the design standards that we're going to go through tonight, and make some comments, and I hope we have a very fruitful discussion. I'll be back likely in May sometime with another version, which will include pictures, diagrams. It's going to be laid out, formatted, a little bit easier to read since this first version was quite dry. So thank you if you made it through the whole document. And I'm going to give an introduction. I have a couple of slides to show on the screen behind you. Just want to mention I am an architect, as Pip mentioned, here in New Jersey, and I practice in New York City for a large corporate firm. I run Architectural Heritage Consultants on the side, which is authoring this project, and I sit on my HPC in Hoboken, New Jersey, as well as also the Zoning Board of Adjustment. So I have a kind of atypical dual appointment to both. One appeals to the other. I'm familiar with how those two, I think, are supposed to interact with one another. So We're going to talk about an overview of the whole project. There's more to this than just the design standards, and then we'll go through the text themselves and some next steps. There's 3 components to the project that the state provided a grant for. The first are the design standards, and the objective there is to, as Pip and Warren mentioned, to revise and update them to make them a little bit more user-friendly. As you all know, they're presently black and white, very, very dense with text, little hierarchy across. We're also going to update them to be consistent with the 2017 Secretary of the Interior standards, which were for the rehabilitation component, I would say subtle in their updates. There's nothing dramatic that changed, but that's going to get changed, updated to be in conformance with that. And then I'll also be including the half a dozen ordinances and policies that you all have adopted in the last 20 years since the last standards were written. Phase 2 of this project, which is really happening concurrently with this first part, Pip and I and Judy actually just met with who was that upstairs? Emily in the clerk's office regarding implementing some enhancements to the Cape May HPC website to, just like the design standards, make that a little bit more user-friendly. And so the two are kind of talking and or speaking the same language and make that more helpful. And the third component will be a public outreach portion, which will be happening later this summer into September. And that'll be broadly about historic preservation in Cape May with a focus on the revised and at that point approved by City Council design standards, and we'll be reaching out to about a dozen different stakeholder groups, everything from your zoning board to local realtors. I'm also a licensed realtor, so I think can understand some of maybe where they're coming from and some of the concerns and problems that they could potentially help resolve when selling properties in the historic district and being mindful of the design standards and also that the HPC even exists. And we'll also be talking to contractors who, of course, are swinging the hammer and pulling the siding off in some cases. So the intent of design standards, broadly speaking, is to provide property owners and design professionals with a clear guide to rehabbing their properties within the purple boundary in the map on the right that you're all very familiar with. They're going to expand upon the Secretary of the Interior standards, try not to be too redundant or copy and paste them in many places. They're really supposed to kind of add on to that and be very contextual and specific to the built environment here in Cape May, which is, of course, very unique. And they're going to serve as a public education tool, especially with the outreach component. And lastly, but very important, they're going to strengthen the ability of this commission to provide a consistent design review for the majority of projects that you see. The design standards will never be able to address 100% of what you review, but hopefully they're able to speak to a good part of many of the applications you see on a monthly basis. Goals include, like I said, being user-friendly. They're going to be hyperlinked, illustrated, colorful. They're going to be provided in bound hard copies, so I think you'll all get one. One will probably go to your library, and they will include a supplemental online database for kind of quick reference, which is part of the website update portion. Just a comparison of what design standards do versus do not. I'll just touch on a couple of these to keep the meeting moving. They do obviously provide upfront guidance to property owners and qualified professionals such as architects. However, they don't and they shouldn't really get as specific or potentially contradictory with your construction code or zoning ordinance, which in Cape May, more than other places, are kind of very close to one another. So we need to make sure those are really treated as two separate documents so each can kind of be updated and has their own lane. They do prioritize design considerations and encourage appropriate alterations, but they don't necessarily regulate the density or location of development. These aren't meant to incentivize or disincentivize development. That would be your planning board. And We also note the design guidelines have really nothing to do with the interior design, provided that you don't see it from the outside. And they do provide criteria to consider prior to demolition, as I think you just had in a recent application, but they're not necessarily explicitly prohibiting demolition, of course, without a thorough hearing before the commission. So the audience is threefold, I think, for these design standards. These are pretty broad categories. There's the applicant and the public, your design professionals, and of course yourselves, your commission and your staff like Judy and Bruce, your compliance officer. And each of these parties have different questions and different objectives, and it's important for the design standards to be, flexible and really speak to each of these three groups. So for this evening, we're going to go through the design standards starting now. If it's possible, I'd like to keep it to really only 5 or 10 minutes per each of the features and systems, which is roofs to flood mitigation. We're not, I don't think, going to be able to solve every issue or disagreement tonight, so we probably will need to table some things. Many of you have added comments throughout the document. If you have any additional ones or a different perspective, please speak up as we're going through them. I've highlighted a couple you'll see that I think we should touch on during the course of this, and then from 7 to about 8 o'clock, I'd like to talk about additions and new construction, which was very expanded as part of this project. You only had maybe 2 or 3 pages on that before, so that has a lot more text, and we'll eventually have a lot more diagrams so that you can effectively review those types of projects, which are always problematic in dense built historic districts like Cape May. The architectural styles portion you'll see has been moved really to the back of the book. It's important to include, I think, still a couple pages on each style, but it's not necessarily something, a component that someone should be rifling through 30 pages of to get to the design standards. So it's still there, it's just later in the book. And there's an appendice, and then hopefully we can open this up to 10 or 15 minutes of questions or comments from the public related to everything we talk about tonight. So does anyone have any questions before I kind of continue? So if you looked at the text closely, you'll notice there's kind of a pattern between many of the different topics, such as roofs, exterior cladding, and windows, where your first 3 standards really start with very similar phrasing, and they're each kind of addressing different types of projects that people may come to you with. So I think it's important that this text be correct and as universally agreed upon as possible, because it's plugged into many 5 or 6 different sections. So the first standard that you have for this is all for contributing buildings would be that if the original or historic fill in the blank, and I can fill in the blank, roof exists and is still functional, every effort should be made to preserve it. I've made very subtle updates to this text. It's, 80-90% of your text is still intact from the 2002 standards. Significantly deteriorated portions should be replaced in kind to match the adjacent. I think that was added since the last version. And then where full replacement is necessary, it should be replaced in kind, replicating the original and then it gets into a series of 3 to 5 descriptive features of, in this case, a roof, which include shape and pitch and material, including character-defining elements such as, and there's more, I just included 3 here, there's chimneys, dormers, and cresting. The standards text, which I'm going to pull up in a moment, has all the others, but is this first standard problematic? Does anyone have any questions or comments about it in a scenario where the existing or historic roof exists? And we're kind of just doing selective patchwork, really. Okay. So this,
I have a question.
sure.
So you're asking for comments?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Should is sort of a permissive word, which we have throughout the current book, and we had talked about changing that to shall.
I could certainly change that. I don't think it would be a major
That just
issue.
makes it a little more definitive.
And a little less passive maybe too.
Yeah, but of course, the problem in using words like shall is that you give a little less flexibility for decision-making. It makes it easier to decide, but you give a little less flexibility and mandate something has to be done. I take shall as not giving us a lot of discretion to make an exception. So you have to understand that that's a burden that comes along with changing that language.
I think that was discussed when the original design standards were put together. I would agree with your observation. When I first joined the HPC, in fact, in my book, I crossed it out and I wrote shall and stuff. But I agree. I think that would be way too restrictive. Should communicates exactly what we want to do, but then gives the commission the flexibility, not necessarily the applicant, gives the commission the flexibility to make some reasonable exceptions. So, Bob, this was discussed originally, wasn't it? Do you recall?
Originally, we had very few shalls in the book. And to address some of the appeal issues that came up, we did change them to shall. Not all of them, but many of them.
If we're on the same topic, I mean, and my comments were made in the course of reviewing this. I have some issues with the number 2 paragraph, particularly because in a lot of our instances, and roofs are a good example, we have situations where the original, and this is a town with a lot of pictures and a lot of photographs and such. We have pictures where original roofing material is shown, but we've been working on a standard that that wouldn't require the use of those original materials if other materials have been substituted and there's no evidence of physical evidence of the other materials. So in my mind, there's a difference between documentary proof, which is it's visible, you can see it, pictures, somebody may have written about it, but that is not a standard that I understand we've been applying strictly at all.
This is a standard really from the Secretary of Interior, the 2017, and in fact, prior. And this HPC has not followed that. We've gone with, as you know, same for same. And there's some practical reasons for that, although we would encourage, when you're going to make a change, to return it to the original.
But
One of the problems has been with roofs, and the problem there is if what I call horizontal sheathing has been taken off and plywood has been installed, and then what you have to do is use this new, I don't know the right term, but there's a plastic weave that goes under the cedar shingles, which allows them to breathe and expand and contract. And the question is whether that's really effective. Some of you may know I have a personal test going on in my own house on that. Findings later. But so what we have said is if there's not cedar literally under the asphalt fiberglass, we've been approving
Right.
same for same.
I mean, we've been pursuing this to require physical inspection, right? So you have an obligation to look to see if those materials are there, but it's a lot it's a lot clearer than going back and finding an old picture, which I would consider documentary evidence. We'd have a heck of a lot of trouble here if we went to all the thousands of pictures that were taken here of cedar shake roofs that have since disappeared.
Well, and
let me go on this the should. The should is a lot stronger than the old mimeograph guidelines that we had. That's why we put should in at the time. We originally had shall and got knocked down to should. And, you know, that was...
So, some of us, Corbin, see it exactly the opposite.
Huh?
Some of us see it exactly the opposite. Shall is the imperative.
Yes, but
I'd
we
like to
didn't
see us
have-
use the word should, because that gives us this flexibility when they come in with a complicated thing, and not all kinds of the most perfect evidence. Should gives us the flexibility, but covers us not locking ourselves in.
Most other design standards that I've reviewed say should. I've come across a few that say shall, but should is 80% of them, I would say. But we could discuss it further. if it's-
And I don't purport for us to solve the number 2 issue tonight. I made it in the comments, and I think we're going to have to think about that.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to draft this tonight.
And I know that this was identified by the subcommittee as potentially a problematic standard, but as Warren mentioned, if you go to the Secretary of the Interior standards and specifically their guidance on the use of imitative or substitute materials, there's really only 4 instances that they think should warrant even a consideration of imitative or substitute materials if the historic material is intact, and those are just, and it's in the text, but that would be the unavailability of the historic material, the unavailability of the historic craft techniques or lack of skilled artisans, which could come up, poor original material, so something that really was just never meant to be in an exterior exposure and just hasn't held up well and doesn't make sense to redo. Probably not that common here in Cape May, or code-related changes. People aren't and shouldn't be replacing asbestos siding, for example. There's nothing in here about cost. There's nothing in here about really aesthetics. Those are the 4 criteria. So I think you do have a rationale in the Secretary of the Interior standards for standard number 2, but I think, you need discretion. Every building is different, and, some of maybe the contributing structures that are on the cusp of maybe not being contributing may be able to deviate from that standard, so that everybody isn't putting cedar shake or shingle.
This
Let's
is,
move forward.
yeah, this is up here as an example of one of the issues, and as you go through the standards, you should be commenting on each individual.
Yeah. Well, I'll go through the
If
text.
we use this kind of detail on every one of these slides, we'll be here till.
Sure, but he's got a common pattern, and he does that through all the elements. So, I've written the same thing with respect to 2 on all the other features. So I'm through with my comments on 2, whether it be this topic or another topic.
Sure. So just to round this out, the 3rd standard, and again, this applies to 5 or 6 different elements: roofs, windows, cladding.
You have to speak up, Steve.
Okay. If the original or historic roof does not exist, but there is evidence of what was originally, I'm sorry, and if there is no evidence.
Yeah, no
Okay, so
evidence.
historic roof isn't there, no evidence. The new roof or window or exterior cladding should replicate what was used during the building's dominant period of style in terms of materials and detail. Refer to architectural styles section for further information. This is not necessarily grounded in the Secretary of the Interior standards. I think you may be able to draw it from it, but it's not black and white. So this is somewhat unique in your existing standards. I didn't really tinker with this one that much, but this would require, a degree of discretion and probably some conversation amongst the commission first to decide. In some cases, it's not totally clear what the building's dominant style or period of construction is, and what material would be appropriate for that situation, again, for a roof or a window or cladding. Okay, I'm going to go to the text now, and we'll start going through that, and then I'll come back to this presentation, and I have a couple examples of different sections that are starting to be formatted with pictures and everything like that, and I'll show you that as well. So this is the document that you all saw, that you received a couple weeks ago. I'm going to make this as zoomed in as possible. This is actually the wrong one. Okay, here's the one. So I highlighted a few comments. The introduction and historic overview process. I've been wordsmithing with both Pip and a couple other people on the subcommittee, so all of these comments that Mark and John and James made will definitely be accommodated in that. The next section is the review process, and I don't think I highlighted any of these as being problematic, but if anyone has anything to add, please jump in as we're going down here. I'll just kind of keep scrolling. So this is meant to really give an overview, and it's going to be hopefully very similar to this updated application process that I think was just issued. I think they're basically saying the same thing. Mr. Feinberg had a couple comments on this, such as noting that you all are appointed as opposed to just volunteer community members. The review process got a lot of comments. Almost everyone that reviewed the text had questions or issues with this section. Again, I got some comments today from Bob on this, and we are looking to make some sort of subtle updates with your existing review process, which I'll flip over to here. That would be, if you're familiar with your standards, it looks something like this. They're across two different pages right now. Let me zoom in since no one can see that. You have a process for just a construction permit, which everyone has to go through. And then there's a more lengthy process for what you call development review, which involves zoning variances or site plan approvals, and those cycle through zoning and the planning board. And I'm still, again, wordsmithing this with Bob, but we're really just, I think, going to be making some kind of graphical updates to this section. The process that you have is going to stay essentially intact. I'm putting development before construction permit because that's how they would occur sequentially for a larger project. Property owner, plan to zoning or planning board, they refer to the HPC. HPC sends advice back to them. Zoning and planning really retain control of that application, make the decision, and then the property owner is on their way to the next step, which they then follow the construction permit sequence. For people that are not seeking zoning variances or site plan approval, they start at this step, which involves them applying for a permit to the construction official downstairs. If necessary, like the project is in the district, it's visible, exterior alteration, that's of course referred to the HPC, and you all know what happens after this point. Grants a C of A, denies a C of A. I'm working with Bob to, of course, clarify your kind of informal or informational reviews to make sure we acknowledge that and when that's appropriate and when it happens. And this is, I think, more or less what we're looking to do with the review process for your updated standards.
When you say the informational, you mean the advisory reports?
Could we back up? Just
Sure.
scroll back up. Because we do three things. Scroll down. Yeah. We do three things, grant certificate of appropriate or deny. But we also provide advice and counsel. It should be reflected somewhere in this graph. For example, tomorrow, we have a review committee meeting, and we have an applicant coming in with informal discussion. What they want to do, they want to get some information from us as to what might be reasonable for their project. And that should be reflected somewhere in.
Right below HPC, review committee, and then on down from there. Review committee's recommendations for full board.
Well, it was. Would you scroll, Stephen, just pull up on the, wait a minute. And anyway, I don't think we have to solve it tonight. The point is, there is an additional element that we provide to community.
Okay.
We meet on site, we meet here. Many of us go to the job sites, and it should be reflected in there. It's beneficial for future applicants, and it's beneficial for us. So the applicant doesn't spend a lot of time, energy, and money, and then come before us with something that we could have said that that's not going to work. So anyway. enough
Okay.
said.
If you go down to the permit review section below that, where it goes to the HPC, if you put inside that box, perhaps, the HPC may conduct informational meeting, conceptual review, or final review, alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, and there really ought to be a way
Yeah.
of being informed in a flow chart, the varying approaches we take with respect to applications. You just get a big box here now.
Yeah, within the
But-
box of HPC,
Yeah,
it clearly
there's actually a lot of stuff going on in that big box. And for the things that people see on our application papers, we require them, for example, to circle conceptual review, final review. Those things probably ought to be reflected in a flow chart. Another comment about the review and decision process is, Bob, you'll have to say how you would characterize this, but we do summary reviews where the approvals are done without a full commission hearing and they result in advice to the applicant that his application's been approved, but there is no certificate of appropriateness that is issued per a resolution covering those matters. And there are a goodly number of them every month, the things that can be done without a full commission hearing.
Okay. I'll continue to work with Bob on, the best
Yeah,
way
he-
to knowledge. I think that's provided for in your ordinance already, what you're mentioning. And much of this is, prescribed by the municipal land use law of New Jersey. So that's just why I'm being extra sensitive to making sure we don't do anything.
I'm not so sure the summary review is, but that doesn't matter. There
I
is-
think beyond land use law, if we're willing and quite able as a group to provide advice and counsel to an applicant before they complete an application, that's good and to be done. And it just should be reflected in the flow chart somewhere.
Sure.
That's already in the ordinance. It's spelled out in the ordinance, but if you put that in the box, it may be clearer to the public.
Okay.
I think one of the most important things about this chart, whether it's the old chart, which is what I thought you guys wanted, the old chart, or if it's a new chart or whatever it is that somebody who's an owner of a property who wants to make a change needs to understand what the process is. I mean, that's the critical thing.
And whether or not they need to come before the HPC at all, whether it's likely that they could get through quickly with a review, or whether it's likely that they need the whole banana.
Yeah, people need to understand where they are on the map,
Right.
on the board
Right.
game.
Right.
So there's also, and you'll see how this gets formatted in the design standards after the review process, some sort of asides of frequently asked questions, essentially, such as what is a contributing building, and then within that, what a key contributing building is. I'm planning on keeping the format of your standards where you have different ones applied to contributing and non-contributing, but I'm not necessarily saying key contributing and contributing because it's a little redundant and confusing potentially to people, so you're going to have two still. The next common question would be, what is exactly ordinary maintenance and repair? And I think that's kind of Janice's point as to what do you even need a permit for and what does the HPC review. And the last line of that is most important, which is that if you have any questions or if you're uncertain about anything, you have to reach out to the construction office because every situation and the extent of your project, and once you pull one thing off, maybe half the siding is going to come down. So the construction office should really weigh in and at least be aware that something's going on there. There's a few other paragraphs up top here about the different kind of steps an applicant would be taking with research and investigation, potentially reaching out to Judy beforehand for their survey to take that information into account, to the Historical Society for maybe a broader history of the block, the importance, maybe I'm biased as an architect, of engaging a design professional in jobs of significant scale, and how an architect or another professional can guide you through the process. Last would be submission materials, and I think there was a comment on here, and I highlighted it.
Well, there's going to be a general comment about submission materials throughout the document.
Yeah, this is from you, James.
It seems to me that a way to cut through the variations we see here, as well as shorten the product, is to make sure that the standards just refer to the things that need to be submitted in our application itself, along with the instructions. I would not want to have to go through each one of these things when the standards could just simply say, and so, to figure out what it is you're supposed to submit in connection with any of these applications, have a look at the HPC application form and the detailed instructions. And those detailed instructions say what you're supposed to submit with respect to each of the items that has to go in. Otherwise, we just risk having some confusion and some inconsistencies. And I say that with respect to every time submission materials appear in this draft. And I think I'm not the only person who noted that.
No, I actually made that same comment because I think, assume that these standards last 20 years. In that 20 years, somebody's going to want to change the application process or things like that, and then it's going to not match.
Yeah, we really have to have the flexibility to adjust our application form and change our instructions, which recently have been enhanced, and the instructions have been changed and beefed up. But as Pip says, they're going to change more often than we do rewrites to design standards, and that's why there ought to be a cross-reference here and not a repetition.
So since everything will now be accessible online, could the standards just simply reflect that you go to the website and seek the link to the application in which it will be clarified what precisely needs to be submitted?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I certainly think we could do that. So the somewhat redundant lists of required submission materials that, it's found at the, I think, second to last part of your existing standards, right before references, can be removed entirely, and we'll just refer to a hyperlink of your updated application form here, which is
Any kind
quite
of
clear.
link, yeah.
I think under the required, if you take that first, you just get the, if it's a key or contributing building, you're going to have a survey from one of the times, that would give you the historical background, data construction, and the property report. That's a package you get from Judy.
Okay.
If it's rated, you should have it.
In a perfect world, yeah, that's all that stuff is.
Photographs, yeah, we want to have the front and adjacent buildings, not necessarily contributing, because it could be a contributing building in a neighborhood where there are non-contributing buildings.
Yeah, that was actually Bob's comment on this as well, was that all the buildings on the block.
It really just highlights the flexibility that you can get by being able to tune your application and your instructions more frequently than have a bunch of design standards that have to be approved by city council, for example.
So what I may do is still provide maybe a broad list of the 5 different types of materials you're going to be submitting, which will include the background, the photographs, the architectural drawings, technical documentations, and we'll talk about this later as well, physical samples if applicable. And then I'll just refer to the application form really for specifics on what exactly those should consist of.
And
We're
under
going to be
the
here, we're going to
architectural
be here
drawings,
until tomorrow morning if we continue this kind of review for free. The HBC has the option of commenting back to Steve on each of these. I think it's appropriate to ask questions and have comments, but
We may not
if
resolve
we
it.
continue
Oh, we're not going to resolve them.
Right.
in this format, we're going to be here a very long time. The idea This is the update. We're all together. The idea of this presentation is to go through what is being accomplished and make available to the public what will be forthcoming. And we're not approving this tonight. We're approving a process, I guess, or the formats. So I would just ask you if you have individual nits that you want to discuss, it should be done, documented back to Stephen. And then when he's back in May, we'll have a whole new book.
Sure. I'll move along a little quicker. I am really trying to ascertain whether there's any big sections you want removed from the text or added, because that'll impact layout and formatting. Guiding standards was updated from the previous to the current. Only 3 words changed for rehab. Historic overview, like I said, we're updating, and now we're into the design standards. So up front, there's going to be a paragraph on composite and imitative materials, which I understand from the subcommittee is something that, potentially has been a struggle in the past. And it's, again, I'll have, like I mentioned before, the kind of 4 circumstances, according to the Secretary of the Interior, that should even warrant considering those types of materials for contributing buildings. So that's all up front. And now we're into roofs, the first. So as you can see, there aren't any really substantive comments so far. Janice had, some grammatical markups, which I'm definitely going to take into account as I look at this closer for readability and everything. There is up front, I'm adding for some of these a little bit more context for applicants so they understand the different types of materials that are found there at the historic district, components with it in the roof system, cornice and eave, gutter, downspouts, flashing, chimneys, and things like finials and cresting under ornamental features. And then, just like you had in your 2002 standards, the, in this case, 8 standards for contributing buildings, which I think we already addressed some of these comments here on the right. I'm just reading from John, James, and Mark.
I think the intention there is we don't want to force people to go backwards. I don't know if everybody agrees with that, but that's what those comments are about right there, from Jim and me, I believe.
Yeah, it's generally been our practice to not force people backwards, which is why I had the problem with number 2 of the overall 3.
So is this something that, broadly speaking, the commission maybe wants to look at a little closer in terms of that standard, or are others kind of comfortable with that position? This does affect roofs, exterior cladding, windows, porches, doors. It's all kind of framed in the same way.
You're using the term should, which gives us the flexibility of going forward. That's this subtle thing that we're doing with roofs, and I think the wording gives us the option to push back or to grant an exception. So
Is that exception, you think, few and far between, or is that becoming more the norm?
well, this is where I had addressed earlier, when for whatever reasons, for decades, this organization has accepted same for same. And with some exceptions. So if you're taking off an asphalt fiberglass shingle and there's wood shingles underneath, then we would expect it to be replaced with wood. So, but this wording allows us to deal with that, I think.
But if someone came in with asphalt shingle roof with just regular sheeting underneath, is the expectation that they're returning to the original?
We would encourage them, at the moment, the way we're doing this is we would encourage them to use cedar on a contributing or a key building. But in fact, yes, we would accept same for same, asphalt fiberglass for asphalt fiberglass.
So maybe one of the ways we could clarify this is clarifying the definition of documentary evidence. Because there's documentary evidence that you could find old photographs, or there's evidence that it's in place on site. Maybe we could make that distinction, and it would help folks clarify more readily.
Okay, and I can probably tie that to this sort of pseudo affidavit that you have people sign as part of their applications for roofing or siding related to that. So, okay, we can add that type of text to standard number 2. Comment here regarding how often, or if you even want to see physical samples of, say, an imitative or substitute material. Is that something the commission is still interested in seeing? Okay, I'm getting a head nod from Warren. And just like your existing standards, I'm still going to include the references to the different preservation briefs, and they will now be hyperlinked within the standards so people can click on them just like that, and they get right to, in this case, the repair and replacement of historic slate roofs.
These are great, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This kind of diagram, I think, caused at least 3 comments of confusion, so I'll be taking that out, not including anything as maybe simplistic as that. Next is exterior cladding. I didn't highlight any comments here as potentially problematic to incorporate, but please, as I'm scrolling down, just speak up if there's anything you have a question or comment for the group on. Again, providing a little context on the different types of exterior cladding. Up front is wood, trim and details. There'll be a diagram of when it's appropriate to do corner boards versus not. Masonry, foundations, a lot of exposed concrete foundations in town, so that'll be addressed. And then there's 4 standards related to exterior cladding, and this second one, again, essentially the same comment that we just went through. There is, I don't believe this portion was part of the roof, which would be adding features that didn't exist, such as a new bay window or something else to the exterior cladding. And the Secretary of the Interior stands, and this is basically right out of it, would say that that would create a false sense of history and really shouldn't be done unless there's an extenuating circumstance. It's a secondary elevation near the back, and the original layout didn't make sense or something. So that can be considered there. Only one standard for non-contributing buildings. Okay, moving on to windows. I highlighted this note regarding vinyl or aluminum. And the comment here was, John, do you want to speak to this maybe? Or this was your comment, and James as well also had a comment on this.
If you can read yours,
Sure.
John,
So-
you're better than I can.
so the-
'cause I
Yeah,
can't
I
read
can't
them.
quite read that, but I think it has to do with that it's not just vinyl and fiberglass, it's fiberglass and aluminum clad as well. We just want to make that distinction, because they're all of those exist. Windows that are fiberglass, windows that are aluminum, windows that are wood with aluminum clad and fiberglass clad and vinyl clad. So I think that's what I'm saying. I can't remember, I can't see that.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Okay, so clad windows, not appropriate.
Because
Just-
manufacturers talk about a wood window, when in fact Anderson 400 advertise it as a wood window, but
it's clad.
And it's not appropriate on a historic building.
On a contributing building.
Or, yeah,
Okay.
so that is,
Shutters, I'm adding a diagram on how to properly size shutters, which this town is pretty good about. There's a couple exceptions to that, but it should cover the opening, screen and storm windows, awnings. And then this is one of a couple kind of asides regarding the importance, I think we can all agree on, of retaining historic windows, that old growth wood, and really replacing them as a last resort. And there's also a diagram that I'm going to draw regarding replacement of windows, because I think that covers kind of a lot of different types of projects where it may be a full, really new construction window where you're taking out the opening, the frame, the sashes versus just inserts. And if the frame is intact, especially if it's a wood-clad building, you should really keep that, because once you pull that out, a lot of the adjacent stuff may fall apart. So it may become a much bigger project. So pushing people toward those if their sashes are fully deteriorated.
Stephen, I have a question.
Sure.
If in fact people have questions about that process, is it possible to have a list of local contractors that can perform that type of detailed restorative work or not?
I wouldn't think so, because the commission wouldn't want to be making recommendations. You could retain one in the office, maybe, yeah, of reputable.
Do other committees do that?
Yes, yes. And they'll never give just one or two. They'll give a very, broad list. Yeah, certainly, that could be appropriate. But again, also for products, I try and keep any descriptions of that stuff generic and not call out, specific products like AZAC or anything. Not that you would use AZAC here. Okay, this is aluminum clad again. I'll pick that up. Suggestion to add maybe another standard on windows in new locations, and that's on a primary front elevation, or you think on the sides, John?
It does come up quite often, and these standards currently are silent on new openings in new locations. So I'm asking whether or not we as a commission would like to include those situations in the standards, and I would recommend that we do.
And is it accurate that the commission would consider those on secondary or maybe not very visible elevations, but not on primary front elevations? I can look into what the Secretary of the Interior says on this further and draft a 10th standard on that.
John, are you referencing adding literally a window?
Yeah, so oftentimes what happens when folks are renovating, contributing buildings, they're putting in a window or moving a window and putting it in a new location or a door, and the standards are currently silent on that. So I think we ought to make at least a statement about it, however we want to comment on that. I'm just raising it as an issue.
And the Secretary of Interior is not silent on it, though. It's not appropriate on a contributing or T building.
However, we often approve them for many, many reasons, so maybe it's a statement that take it under consideration on its merits in particular cases or something like that.
Well, and what we have done is, of course, is normally on the front facades.
No.
It's been no.
Right.
And if it's really visible from the front of the side yard, it's no.
Okay. I'll pull some text from the second.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, how you characterized it a few minutes ago sounded appropriate to me, but I don't know what everybody else thinks.
Well, we get another shot at this.
Okay, I'll put something in there.
This is something that you should discuss with Bruce, because he's brought it up to me about window replacement several times, about changes in the opening size.
Oh, yeah, so that, Judy brings up a good point. It's not just new openings in new locations, but it's changing the size and configuration of existing openings as well. Right, so all that falls in that same category.
Right.
Along those lines, is this policy still current that the HPC does not review replacement windows? Again, this is non-contributing buildings now, if they're as divided as the original. It's very specific. So it says here, the HPC is not required to review replacement windows if they're as divided. Like if they're a 4/4, you could replace it with an 8/8, but not a 2/2. Is that current policy, or?
That is the current policy, not to be confused with whether it should be
Okay.
going forward, but that is the current policy.
Okay, so I'll leave that for now, and if we want to take it out during the next round, you could just let me know
Well,
as a group.
if you if we're going to look at that, one of the problems that we have, which we have not recognized as Cape May HPC, the Secretary of Interior is clear on divided lights. That shouldn't be on a dual pane window, and, you know, an insert in it. I think we're pretty clear on, not snap-ins, but we're talking about embedded, and so we should probably, not tonight, but we should probably give some thought to this as a group, as we do this, and take a position. There's a lot of replacement windows in the community already, you know, that have
Yeah, things have moved beyond the snap-ins to when you have multiple glass, the glued-on divided, as opposed to the pockets for each individual pane.
Well, there are four ways that you can use mullions. There's real ones, there's glue-on, there's snap-in, and then there's the ones with insulated windows that they put an insert in, which actually looks very much like it's a full mullion, right?
Yeah, and this is one that may have already escaped us, because we've approved a lot of windows in the community.
I'm guessing there are a lot of gelled ones that are going in with exactly.
So I would
that.
suggest we just consider what we want to exclude and just state that, because there's, actually, I said there's four, there's hybrids of those four, so, right?
I would also suggest then, again, in the office, that we have a listing of manufacturers that manufacture the windows that you prefer to use, which is also a question that comes up for me.
Okay, and
Bob, can we do that legally?
Well, plus what we've been doing is we've been talking about a wood window that is exterior primed, and regardless of the manufacturer. So then the burden is on the applicant to figure out whether the wood window that they want to buy is true wood window and it's primed. And we require previously in this document and in the windows, we're looking for cut sheets, catalog cut sheets, so we'll be able to see it. So we don't have to have a list. I mean, all the manufacturers, many of the manufacturers provide multiple configurations, so.
And
Especially Cape May lumber.
if you're,
Tell them to go to the local lumber shop, they're going to get exactly what they need to know.
and if a,
This is a public meeting, Tom.
Denweld makes a double pane window with a divider in between, but you can have glued mountains on both sides of the window. So it really looks like it's a true divided light, but it's not.
It really does.
and for a contributing building where replacement sashes are warranted, that should really be the minimum. A true divided light, you're talking about a simulated divided light?
It's an SDL, but it looks like it.
Sure.
Distance.
Yeah, aesthetically, from the street, indistinguishable from a true divided light, and I don't think there are that many window manufacturers that make true divided lights.
From a manufacturing standpoint, it's a nightmare.
You have the warranty issues, and the
Yeah,
windows go.
I've had them custom made, and the two vendors that I've been using are both out of business, so.
So,
You would have thought they'd have a lot of repeat business, although on the high end.
and so I'll pass this section around as we continue on here, just showing some diagrams like that I will incorporate for the Cape May standards that speak to true divided lights, which you're really only going to get in a historic window with single light glazing versus a simulated divided light where there's the spacer bar in between and the buttons on exterior and interior. And that also has different types of windows, which you see in the historic Victorian district like here. Okay, again, back to the text, there's 4 bullets, and I'm probably going to add a 5th per someone's comment on the right here, again, regarding the importance of keeping your historic windows. Hyperlinks to the federal resources. So now we're on to porch and entrance. Could
we just back up one second? That bothers me, and I wasn't going to comment. The shaded area, would you just back up? I'm not we keep showing this as the municipal code. And it doesn't seem necessary.
Yeah, that's not good. That will not be in the final version or what you get next month. I was just listing that for,
Okay.
it's really only for solar panels that you have specific.
See the right side?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to be formatted pretty differently than this, much clearer and tighter. Porch and entrance, I don't believe this was, this was called porches in your 2002 standards. So policy summary is intact from before, definition of a porch, adding in flooring and stairs, railing and lattice work.
I've seen this.
Tom Carroll on our bike ride yesterday mentioned the importance of like 3-inch spacing, not 4 or, God forbid, more than that for the spacing of the balusters. Importance of framing the lattice work under the porch, which for the most part people have done in town. And then this has still 7 standards related to porch and entrances. Addressing wood porches, 5 addresses masonry porches, 6 speaks to booster rails, which I saw a couple examples with Tom yesterday of. We'll have pictures of that and a diagram. And then the 7th standard addresses enclosing a porch. And I have a picture of Janice's neighbor, for example, as maybe a not so appropriate example of a porch enclosure, which removes the depth of that porch. 2 standards for non-contributing buildings, comment on the use of vinyl here. So I guess, Janice, the comment was related to the color of the vinyl lattice work? You said, since we only encourage and do not control. And your ordinance does, by the way, well, and I'll get to this when we see architectural styles, your ordinance does mention paint colors, so I understand something you don't review intensively at this point, but I am planning to provide at least gentle recommendations of appropriate, historic paint color palettes, you'll see, but I can remove references to colors throughout the standard if that's something you all feel is appropriate. This is, I believe, a new section related to illumination and hardware at your porches and entrances. Something I saw around town was maybe some lights that are too cold in temperature, too bright in intensity, strange things people have placed all over their front lawns that in aggregate really begin to diminish a historic district. So this section speaks to not doing that and keeping, to a less is more type thing for illumination, other than obviously around Christmas when the town looks quite spectacular. Next section is doors. Something I highlighted here for discussion relates to the replacement of, I guess, chestnut doors on maybe a craftsman or bungalow style home. Thanks, James. And whether it's still okay for people that have a chestnut door to come in with oak. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that?
What is your question?
So the standards,
Yeah, I mean, a chestnut, you can't get chestnut door.
okay.
So if it's there, you should preserve it the best you can, but if it has to be replaced, it's going to be replaced
And you,
with something else.
but as specific as oak, or could they consider other
I'm
other
comfortable
woods?
with oak or mahogany.
Yeah, I think the point was, there's no point in confining a replacement to oak, which is sort of where this was going. If you can get a good hardwood that makes a good door,
With a similar grain pattern, maybe
yeah, I
we
mean,
can broaden
it seems
that.
to me that's
Okay.
as much as you can expect someone to do.
Yeah.
8 standards here related to doors. Okay, now we're on, this is a big section, obviously, site and streetscape. This was previously just called streetscape, and I updated to also include site because the Secretary of the Interior standards have a whole section called building site, which I think this is essentially saying the same thing as. So,
Suggestion there, under definition to include, specifically include parking. It's been a hot issue here lately.
okay, I can add that. So this section is presently divided into 4 sections, one of which relates to parking, which is driveways. So there's sidewalks, preserving slate, not using asphalt, maybe being more specific about the color temperature of lights along those sidewalks, I can certainly add that. Fences, each of these have their own kind of separate standards, about half a dozen each. And this is the first section, by the way, that was not, and I don't think, I agree with this, still should not be divided into contributing versus non-contributing buildings. There's kind of just one set of standards for streetscape, and I think you'll hold the line on the contributing harder than maybe a non-contributing building in East Cape May. Driveways, so this was something I highlighted, and I think Bob already mentioned it. This is from the 2002 standards, which is that locating off-street parking in the side yard is not appropriate if the area is visible from the street or the front yard. I see many instances in town where this is not achievable. So is this something that we need to maybe dial back, or are people comfortable still with this policy position?
The position that we've been taking is, this is a little more strict. The position we've been taking is off-street, the car should be parked beyond the front of the house. This,
Behind the building setback line.
yeah, this standard is, if it's visible from the front or the side yard, it's not going to be possible.
Well, sometimes the site constraints mandate side yard parking, and the setback won't allow enough space for there to be a driveway and screening. I think our policy has been, that's acceptable under those circumstances so long as there's not a parking space that extends past the front elevation of the house.
Right.
And that's what my comment there is. My question is, should that be the house or the porch? And I was suggesting the house, not the porch.
No, we've been using the house.
Yeah.
And if the code requires 2 parking spaces, then both cars should fit beyond the front facade
Right.
of the
Okay.
house, as a minimum. We encourage them to park in the back.
As far back as possible. And, this can only be obviously enforced to a certain point. People are, if they have a driveway, are kind of going to park wherever they want. So this may be something that is implemented by your council as
Well,
some type of
enforcement
local
is
ordinance.
different. Is a
Yes.
issue, but first,
If you're doing a site plan review, people should not be getting credit for spaces that are in the front yard.
Right.
Got it. It's the same case in Midtown Manhattan. You're not even allowed to have exposed parking there, so it always has to be enclosed. I think I added this, by the way, as this came out of the subcommittee. Anytime lighting is mentioned, encouraging dark sky compliance. I don't think you have any turtles migrating across the beach, but it's kind of based on that whole principle. Last topic in site and streetscape is yards. And I'm not sure you had anything on yards really in your 2002 standards, but this is fairly brief, and it speaks to decks and patios, fire pits always being in a rear or side yard, light fixtures. And this is the series of small light fixtures along the driveway, not appropriate. And then lastly, I think this is implicit in a historic district, but that the garbage and recycling containers should be screened and not anchored in people's front yards.
One of the issues we're currently dealing with is, I think, the building code allows, if you plug in the lights, like Christmas lights, then they're permitted by ordinance. That seems to have evolved into, if you have plug-in lights and you want to light up your eaves or your soffits or something, that because they're plug-in, it's okay. So I think we need something in the historic district that talks about,
Appropriate seasonal decorations.
this plug-in thing has been an escape, and that's why you see the lighting around town is becoming very contemporary.
Okay, so maybe adding some specifics to what seasonal lighting is, which is that it's temporary and should not be up year-round. 'Cause
Appropriate for the season, maybe, which, like a Christmas season,
Okay,
not
Oh.
meaning the whole summer season.
I'll add that. Again, I mean,
And
Or the whole year.
And the advertising that you're trying to get out of it.
it's an enforcement issue, people plugging light
Well,
fixtures
right now,
in.
you can't enforce it because
It's not written
the
anymore.
code is clear. If it's plugged in, you can have it.
Okay. Next section, and this is becoming its own, is storefronts. This has a lot written by the Secretary of the Interior for guidance, so I think it's important this becomes its own storefront. So these are, its own section, these are 7 standards related to storefronts. There's one comment here regarding inward opening doors. I mean, if a business has less than 74 people in it, technically they could have an inward-facing door. If they're going to have more than that, I agree with you, James, it's going to be difficult for them to get a variance, but I think it's important that the commission at least request it.
Yeah, I don't see that variance getting granted by anybody when they're told there's a possibility people can be burned to a crisp and can't escape. I mean, that's not realistic these days.
No, the point here is to take the existing door and rehang it.
Yeah, right, and that's fine, for it to go outward.
So part and parcel with storefront is signage. This is kind of a new subsection to that. I'm going to have some diagrams, 6 of them, about really the different types of signs you see in the district. Most commonly is like a carved wood panel. Then there's dimensional signs, pin-mounted awning. An important note on awning is that the lettering or artwork should really ideally only be kept to the vertical skirt or valance portion of the awning, not become like a billboard that's 6 feet tall atop. Blade or bracket signs, again, making sure those are, and your ordinance is actually pretty specific. Unfortunately, for me, a tall person in Hoboken, ours is not, but that you should keep adequate pedestrian clearance below so people don't walk into the sign. And then there's a section just like illumination for entries. In a residential context, this is illumination in a commercial context. So this is really tackling Washington Street and the different types and recommended spacing so we don't have situations where things are wildly over illuminated and blowing out, their neighbor. New section, the Secretary of the Interior would call this code-required work. I'm just saying, I think a little bit more precisely here in town, this is accessibility-related stuff, which there's a fair amount of in town with people aging in place. So this will only be a page, but really that if someone's adding a ramp, it should be done somewhat sensitively, and if it's going to be a ramp that's 50 feet long, they should consider a lift, which I saw at that, I can't remember the name of it, the black-colored hotel near the waterfront. Instead of putting a ramp on the front, which they probably couldn't fit, they put a lift on the ocean side. Modifying doors is something that may come up under accessibility. Again, always doing that.
Does the secretary say anything about elevator additions?
It does have stuff under code-required work. Is that something you see in town often with the hotels, or? Yeah. I mean, you really have to look at that as, I think, more of an addition to the building. It's probably less of an accessibility thing, because you have to treat the impact on the exterior profile of the building and what that's doing to the streetscape if it is on a visible side yard. Mechanical and utility equipment. Now, this is incorporating at least one of the ordinances that you've passed since 2002 related to solar technologies. And I added quite a bit of text, some of which was from the ordinance, some of which I added here regarding when it's appropriate to consider solar technologies. Again, always emphasizing that they should really never, ever be visible from the street. And that also any incidental equipment that comes along with solar panels on the roof, which there's a lot of, there's new panels and stuff, just making sure that's mounted or on the rear or at least screened so it's not dominating a secondary elevation. And then another ordinance you've added, which, in short, no windmills in town. And this would probably have a tie into your ordinance with a link just like that to roof-mounted solar energy systems. Next section, also a new one, is flood mitigation, people raising houses, both at the federal level and state level. There's a bit of guidance on this in a historic district, so much of this text comes from your ordinance, which was based on those two documents. That ordinance was extremely thorough, so I was able to basically replicate the 8 points spelled out there, a couple minor wordsmithing changes, but it's what you had in your ordinance. Garage doors are prohibited when visible directly from the public right-of-way as part of that section. Okay, now we're on to additions. Only 20 minutes behind schedule. So there's a policy summary up front. This was previously within your new construction standards. It started on page 70, and it actually only ran 2 pages of the 2002 standards. So this whole section has really been broadened quite a bit. And I'll go to, if I can move this bar around just briefly, something we reviewed with the subcommittee last month related to new construction and additions. All of this is based on standard number 9 and 10 of the rehab standards by the Secretary of the Interior. We went through a whole annotative exercise with the subcommittee on those, and I can provide this to the commission if they're interested in going through this as well. But effectively, I think there's 4 different types of additions, and I'm speaking about additions to the building, but then also additions of new buildings within your district. I think those are both additions at different scales. And the 4 categories range from very compatible, which would be literal replication, shown on the bottom picture there, the Jewish Museum in New York City, with the left portion being done in the 80s and the right portion being about 50 or 60 years older than that. Next, moving to what I'll call invention within a style, which I think our Capitol building represents, and then continuing further and further to the right, where things become more and more differentiated from either the historic building that the addition is being attached to or other contributing buildings in the district. So you come to abstract reference, which is exemplified there by the Aldo Rossi Scholastic building on Broadway in Soho, taking datums from the adjacent buildings, continuing those across, but introducing, in this case, a postmodern design language. And then on the far right, and I think a lot of people actually come in with projects that they may want to categorize this way, which I think is very dangerous. In most cases, this would be intentional opposition. That's the Hearst Tower. So that's a Pritzker winning architect, Norman Foster, putting an addition on a historic building in Midtown, putting a giant tower on top of it, really. And this has to be done with the absolute utmost care, just like literal replication. Both of those are things that a district like Cape May, the scale and level of development and intact nature, you should really be staying away from here, I think. So for the most part, I'm going to recommend, and you'll see through the text, people should really be steered toward either invention within a style or, and maybe this is probably 49%, abstract reference to the historic building. I think pushing them more toward compatible and less toward differentiated, broadly speaking, is where you're going to have the most success. And I think you've been doing that as a commission, but just this is kind of giving you the full spectrum. So back to the text. And this is the really key line that I inserted, and Janice flagged it in support. In the fundamental interest of preservation and sustaining Cape May Historic District's valued character, compatibility is emphasized over differentiation in Cape May. I may bold that or, emphasize that a little bit better than it's reading right now. So there's a couple different kind of broad categories of standards that I think the commission should be reviewing when they have an addition project. The first is site placement, where it is in relation to the adjacent buildings, the one it's being attached to, the height, massing, proportion, and scale. This is a comment someone from the subcommittee added, and it was related to the line, additions should always be subordinate and not compete visually with the original building. The roof height of a side or rear yard addition should be at a lower elevation than that of the existing building. That's essentially verbatim from the Secretary of the Interior's guidance on additions to historic structures, so unless anyone on the commission feels differently, I think we should keep that line. And then the third broad review category for additions is the architectural characteristics. This would probably be referring the applicant back up into the earlier standards, roofs through site and streetscape. And then I broke down the standards for additions into 3 different categories. The first, because each of these they're all inherently different types of additions with different degrees of impact. One of them has no impact really to the building itself. That would be the carriage house. But for a side or rear yard addition, there's a couple different pieces of criteria for those, for the different topics I just mentioned. There's policy for, again, this is something in the backyard. This is not touching the building, but you need to consider carriage house or accessory structures carefully in town because few houses had garages, or if any. So adding those in an improper way could really destroy the streetscape. And then the third, which I don't think is too common because most people already have porches if they were meant to have them, would be your porch additions. And if this is not something you see all that often, I can certainly take this one out. I don't know have there been any porch addition projects recently?
Yeah.
Or- Okay.
Yes, we've had.
People do try and add porches. Okay, so I'll keep that. And there'll be diagrams, which I was showing to Judy from the last project, like clear, appropriate versus inappropriate kind of extremes for all these different types of additions to make it really clear to people what the commission may or may not consider. So before I get to new construction, were there any comments or questions on the additions standards? Okay. So now we're on to new construction. So like I said, this is really a macro scale, I think, addition to your historic district, but it demands its own kind of set of standards because you have a clear site and you have a potential, if you put an inappropriate new construction project, to really disrupt your streetscape, which is very important here in Cape May, and really detract from other historic and contributing buildings on the block.
One of the things that we've been using, it's not documented, and we may want to consider, we've been talking about new construction being a contemporary interpretation of one of the designs in the standards.
Invention within a style, potentially.
A contemporary interpretation of that style, so you can avoid the modernistic. We're not even close to wanting something modernistic. So, and that's worked well for us, but I don't think it's been documented, so this might be the time to.
Yeah, I think the highlighted text there that a couple people commented on speaks to that, which says differentiation through a strongly contrasting modernist style for new construction in intentional opposition to the historic fabric is also not appropriate, because if this happened 50 times, it would result in essentially, 50 UFOs crashing in town, and you would have a very different Cape May than you all know today. And that would gradually erode the historic character. So I agree, Warren, that's important to emphasize. And I'll bold this or maybe add more emphasis to it.
That language is great because it explains why.
Thank you. Okay, so there's a couple different, again, types of criteria you should consider when you have or when you're faced with a new construction project before the commission. Similar to additions, the first is site placement. And this, again, speaks about compatibility. Contextualism is very important when you're doing a new construction project in a historic district. And the commission should really be demanding a very high degree of both, architecture and design, but also genuine materials. People should not be cheaping out on stuff like that, because you're in the Cape May Historic District, and there should be a higher bar for architecture, as I think the commission has been able to uphold, but this should be pretty clear on that. I added under the height, massing, proportions, and scale from a suggestion from the subcommittee, if possible, and this is a little difficult to consider sometimes, but if there's a significant view shed across or adjacent to the subject property where there's a new construction project, preserving that if possible. I think that really enhances the historic district and the pedestrian experience through it. Materials, development patterns, and architectural features are the other three things that should be considered with a new construction application. And there's a couple different standards related to those. Something that we'll need to coordinate with your new application form, which I'm recommending you include, and this also came out of the subcommittee as a required submission, would be, I'm just looking for it here it is, the last one, a three-dimensional architectural rendering from the pedestrian level, not a bird up in a tree, from the pedestrian level, what you're all going to see if the project is approved and built. And the onus is on the applicant and their professional to make that as accurate as possible, because, many times they're showing those to their client, and I think they should be submitting those to the commission. Most architects that are practicing today are more than capable of making these types of views, and it's important that the commission, ideally at the conceptual review phase, sees those so you can really understand how that building fits into the context. Adding in, this is from the Secretary of the Interior standards. I think you may have had this before in your 2002 standards, but just addressing the relocation of structures in town, citing those appropriately, linked to a very extensive federal guideline on moving historic buildings, so that if that comes up, which I don't think it does too often in town, but there's a few instances of it, but it may not be every year. Moving a historic building, 60 pages on it. Okay, and then lastly, one of the more unfortunate things that the commission may see would be demolition, and I'm essentially just pasting your 9 criteria into the standards, which, I don't know if these have changed recently, if you foresee them changing in the future. I don't necessarily want to include them if these are going to change and potentially be in conflict with one another. Okay, these have been set for a while. Okay, and that concludes the standard portion, and I'll go to the architectural styles next. Somehow we're actually ahead of schedule now. So did anyone have any questions or comments related to additions, new construction, relocation, or demolition?
No, we've commented as we've gone. We do have some people from the public. with regards to the standards, the next portion is, I don't see as controversial. I mean, it is what it is. So maybe if there's someone from the public that has a question about the standards, this might be the time to approach the podium. I'm not encouraging or discouraging, but you've been there, you've been patient.
You've got one already.
One here. Bob Malthovo or Jefferson Street. And just started attending these meetings, just moved down here more or less. Bought a house in 2015, but now I'm retired, so I spend more time here than I did previously when I was working. And so I'm trying to understand the standards, and it's not always particularly clear. You may have seen me at the meeting the other day and listening to the discussion, and it didn't seem like we had a clearly defined standard that we could convey to the applicants what they're trying to comply with. And I'm not as familiar with these standards as I would like to be, and I've only had a short time to look at them, but trying to, whatever way we can make it more clear from what building materials should be, to reference to say appropriate to that time. I'm not sure that I, as a homeowner, say, well, what's appropriate to that time? And I see a lot of different things around town, so I'm not always sure how things were approved. If you look down on Beach Avenue, that big one that just raised up with the big cap, it used to have cedar roof. Now it's got a steel dome and plastic railings coming down to the street. So I don't think that was appropriate material then, and I think it's an historic building. This appears to have been here quite a while, but I know that what was presented here probably didn't present plastic railings, or did, and then who enforces the standards that are approved here during the construction phase and post-construction?
We do have a compliance officer. We have a person who's specifically charged with enforcing HPC-approved products and style and design.
And so then when somebody's out of compliance, and now I'm assuming is it a penalty fee, or does it go back and fix type?
Well, that's
capability?
multifaceted, but I mean, first there's a stop order, a red tag.
Right.
And then the applicant has to come back and come back to us for a different plan, or has to conform to the existing plan. If it persists, yes, there is a fine capability that we have, and the compliance officer, as part of his job description, does have the ability to issue a violation and drive it to court.
I did see now, it talked about materials. I did see reference to style sheets that seemed to allude to materials, but I didn't see any online. It just referenced the style sheet. See a style sheet for the cladding for the side or for some parts, and I just didn't know where it said see the style sheet in the manual, but it didn't have a reference. So there's no link that I saw that took you to a style sheet.
I'm not familiar with that.
I'm not,
Quite.
maybe I don't understand the term
Style sheet.
I'm just,
you're using. We have, there's architectural designs in the existing standard, and we're going to look at new and improved version of that, I presume.
yes, no, I understand. This is an upgrade to the document that I see online, and I appreciate that. I saw reference in there multiple times to style sheets in your manual.
Yeah, I saw that too, and it's in the existing standards online.
Correct.
Starts on page 14.
Right. But I didn't see any style sheets themselves, which alluded to me, at least my interpretation was those were references to specific materials that could be used to complete that particular section.
I think it was referring to the next portion, what we're going to talk about.
And they don't get as specific as materials per se, like use mahogany wood here, yellow pine there, but they talk more broadly about features and
Yeah.
systems
Yeah.
that are
Think-
appropriate on different style homes, like a Queen Anne should potentially have Palladian.
I think the problem is the word sheets. It's the style examples that are,
If it's going back to the front part, we're talking
Yeah.
about the style of buildings.
It's going back to like the federal style or,
I mean, you're going to see the styles, and you're going to see under the design standards, what's appropriate and what's not. And when you actually get into making applications, there are detailed material sheets that the applicant has to actually state what it is he expects to do in the application and
Right.
put it on.
So where does he go to find out what materials will fit that particular?
Well, we've just been reviewing a number of things, I think, that tell you that, for example, wood and this and that, it can be used and not be used. When those are finalized and updated, they're going to have a pretty good list of things that are appropriate.
I think he's asking a different question.
Excuse me?
And then not related particularly, but you mentioned your code enforcement. Is that same office the same one? If I go around, there's very few buildings around that aren't well-maintained. One comes to mind, I walk a lot around Congress Hall and over on Congress Street. There's
yeah, we,
30-34, whatever it is over there on that corner. That looks,
yes, both, there's two. Our code enforcement person is charged with that responsibility, and we notify the owner, property owners, and we've had pretty good response with that. The construction office, though, also has that capability, which is not HPC.
right.
But, so there's two avenues for that to be corrected, and
Okay. Thanks, appreciate it.
thank you. Okay.
Anyone else? Okay.
Question, in our current standards, we have a page of definition of key terms. Is that included in the revision?
So
I know
all-
there's glossary.
Yeah, it's not going to be as high up, but I did include a glossary at the end, and if the term is italicized, that means it's defined in your ordinance, such as alteration, and then I also threw in 50 other terms there. So I didn't pull a separate definition of key terms. 'Cause
These are not features or these are the basic terms. What's a historic district, historic site, key building, contributing building, survey,
So the
certificate of appropriate. These are things that come up all the time.
The contributing versus non-contributing building is addressed up front under the introduction, but I didn't necessarily put anything related to the fact that Cape May is a certified local government, like that portion does. Up front?
That one is not here. National Historic Landmark District is.
The National Historic.
It's these terms. I just didn't see them in the revision.
Yeah, they're all covered under the glossary, but I used the ordinance's definition and not necessarily whatever was written in 2002, but I can revert to that if.
I'd recommend that because
Okay.
it's right up front, it's clear, and these things, particularly when we're talking to the zoning board or other boards who have to deal with these things and they're not familiar with these terms, it would be helpful.
Okay, I can put that.
Bob, are you talking about these key terms on page 7?
Yes.
Yeah, I condense it a little bit, some definitions like,
It might.
I'll look into it for the
Okay.
revision next month
The
and come
other
up with
comment,
something.
I throw this out to the commission too. I wonder if, this comes up in appeals too, if we could include a statement, again, maybe right up front, that would say this. The Historic Preservation Commission reserves the discretion to give such weight to each design standard criteria as the HPC determines appropriate on a case-by-case basis, so that we're not locked into the specific element that we have to have. It's not in the book, or it is in the book, but there's some reasons in that application, we don't want to follow it.
That's why shall is good over should.
Yeah, yeah. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah.
Totally.
That's exactly what we do.
Yeah, particularly,
It is, and it establishes the basis for making our decisions that make them look rational.
Well,
And,
particularly
and,
the
and so,
language about
and so the fact that they are rational is what supports us in the appeal process.
What I hear from the zoning board is, oh, that's not in your book. You know, you shouldn't have done that, it's not there in black and white. Well, there's got to be some discretion for the commission within the purposes and the guidelines and to deviate.
It makes sense to me.
Uh,
I don't see a downside of adding that.
That's an excellent suggestion as far as I'm concerned.
particularly the language about being on a case-by-case basis. That's critical.
Yeah, so why don't you provide
I
that
can-
wording?
I can provide that to you, yeah.
And I would just add that in cases where you are deviating from any of the design standards, obviously to include, a clear rationale
Yeah.
with the final C of A or resolution, so that if it does end up in an appeal situation, the zoning board or whoever can, follow the path the commission took.
Yeah,
Ju-
hopefully.
Much like how a zoning board is judging each application on its individual merits and pointing to what your neighbor did is not and cannot be a rationale for why you should get a zoning variance.
Right.
This discussion kind of goes back to the comments from the gentleman from Jackson Street as to why can't we really create a document that would give you the directions to follow, right there to every letter. That's come up an awful lot, and we really, if we could do that, we really wouldn't need an HPC. It would be just you follow the book and that's it. But with every different type of building, period of construction, elements that were available at different periods of time, it's really why we're discussing why we need to say we measure these things as most important, a little less important, and try to come out with the best product we can.
So I'm going to share now just a quick comparison between your existing standards. Up on the screen here, a few different sections of those, and how I'm looking to kind of reformat them, and also to the gentleman who spoke's point, make things a little clearer with hierarchy, colors, drawing people's attention to the important stuff on the page, and including text to the less important things, but not calling undue attention to it. So here's your existing, just 5 pages from the introduction, not necessarily in order. And this is the beginnings of how I'm laying out the new standards. The gray boxes on that front cover, obviously placeholders, and will be filled in with some of the, I'll show you also 1,100 pictures that myself and Mary Pat from the subcommittee have taken so far, which is good because the leaves are starting to come in and buildings are starting to hide. So we got a lot of pictures back in February. There'll be a table of contents again. This will be hyperlinked, so when people open up this document in full, which it'll also, I think, be provided in piecemeal sections, but you can click on roof or addition, and it'll bring you right to that page, and you don't have to flip through the 50 pages prior. We looked at this flow chart already, and I'll be taking all those suggestions into account when I revise that. The review process, it's a lot, there's the same amount of text on the page, but it's a little less crowded now, and if this is coming out, so be it, but on the right here was the required submission materials is kind of a checklist that people could read through, and then below that would be a definition of a term, in this case, ordinary maintenance and repair, and how that's incorporated. Here's your existing roofs standards. There's 2 pages right now. It's divided into 2 columns, and the standards kind of flow into different columns, which is a little bit tough to follow. And then hidden down here are the standards for non-contributing buildings, and then again flowing into a different column are the submissions, the reference to the style sheets, and then a very long list. Maybe it's an MLA format of the different references from the Secretary of the Interior's. Again, in progress, but I'm looking to expand this section into several more pages, like we talked about in the text, providing that context up front for the different types of forms of buildings so homeowners understand kind of what they're dealing with, what they have, why it's important in the district, different types of materials for roofs. So this will have wood shingle, slate, metal, and of course, asphalt fiberglass shingle. It'll talk about why your roof, if you do have cedar, shingle is just that and not a cedar shake roof, for example, that terminology. Cornice and eaves, the parts of a cornice, making sure that if there's a new construction or addition, that those are being at least acknowledged. Different types of gutters, a lot of use-style gutters, a lot of box or built-in gutters in the district, so calling those out, lined pole gutters. If you have these and a homeowner's flipping through the book, they'll understand why when they come to the commission. You guys think rightfully so, those are really important to keep if you have built-in gutters. And then the last portion of the roof section will speak to chimneys, ornamental features, and there'll be, like this image in the top right, pictures of, I'm sorry this is so small on the screen, but that's a vinyl-clad chimney on a building within the district, and there's really no appropriate situation where you have vinyl or any type of cladding on a chimney, so that should really be avoided, and that's going to be called out right in the text as opposed to grouping all the inappropriate conditions together to the end. And then lastly, rounding out each section will be your standards, clearly delineated here, listed. I'm planning on bolding the important terms so people can read through it quickly and see what each one is speaking to, and they don't need to read 3 sentences to get to the fact that number 8 is speaking to chimneys, for example. And then below that, in gray, so drawing a little less attention to itself, will be the standards for non-contributing buildings. So I'm always planning on putting your contributing buildings, most important, up top here in blue. When you print this and look at 8.5 by 11, I promise you it's more legible than it seems on the screen, but it now has hierarchy. And then the same for, here's an example of one of those style sheets for the Queen Anne style right now, leaning on the historic building survey drawings that you have on the wall in this very room. And then on the right, it's again a list that's a little bit disorganized, I'll say. It doesn't necessarily relate to the standards like chimneys. I'm going to put with roofs, cladding is exterior cladding, ornaments I incorporate into the other sections because there isn't that standard. And also, as is referenced here on the previous, as you see here, you do actually acknowledge broadly what color palettes are appropriate for Queen Anne style. So now the new version of this page is a little bit cleaner and hopefully easier to follow. It has the same pattern on the right, general roof, exterior cladding. It goes in the order of the standards now. Everything is kind of speaking the same language. And then the last section, and I'm still working on this using the Moss books and everything for appropriate color patterns that I think the commission is just recommending and not necessarily making any type of approval contingent upon. But if someone's interested, if they have a Queen Anne, what colors might be appropriate, painting the whole thing black is not appropriate. So it diminishes the detail, and they should be looking at a bold and contrasting palette. You don't want to become the color police, but I think it's important to give some general guidance so you don't have houses that you can't read any depth or differentiation on. And then on the right are just some selective excerpted drawings, again from the Historic Building Survey, of important features. And on the bottom of that first page, I'm going to try and find 3 kind of exemplary. These are not the best right now because I'm still working on better pictures of Queen Anne and all the others, but different examples of these in town if people care to walk around and see other Queen Annes if they have one of these. Okay.
Boy, the graphic pattern on the standards is particularly helpful. So at the end of each section, really clear, these are the standards, right?
So I don't know, because there weren't too many comments on the styles. I mean, the biggest revision here is that to make this read as less of a prescriptive pattern book. I'm putting the styles really second or third. These are going to start around page, let's say 60 or 70 in the book. If it turns out being about 90 pages, I think is what this standards book will be. So they're in there. They're essentially intact. I've really only made cosmetic updates if there was something that was like clearly wrong. Much of this is out of the Virginia McAllister Field Guide to American Architecture. In many cases, it was just replicated from that, which is good. That's a very generally accepted standard book for these types of things. I did notice, so let me see here, I'll just run through the styles quick. So we're still going to have Federal style, that's the earliest, then Gothic Revival, Romanesque Revival, Renaissance Revival, Italianate. I grouped Octagon and, I'm trying to think which else. There were a couple different standards here. I grouped Octagon into Exotic Revival since there's only 1 or 2 instances of that in town. One. I don't think that deserved its own.
One that we know.
It's a nice building. I don't think it deserved its own page, so that's going to be with the Exotic Revivals now. Late Victorian, this is where you get your Second Empire stick, Queen Anne shingle. And then moving into the period revivals. Under Colonial Revival, I can add something that acknowledges the prevalence of Dutch colonial revival styles in town, which I think you had an application on a month or 2 ago, speaking to the gambrel roof and everything, why those should not have porches. Tudor Revival style, not too common in town. And then Spanish Revival, again, not too common. So for these styles, I'm probably going to condense it to just 1 page. The others will get a full 2-page spread. And then lastly, fairly common here would be the bungalow style house. And then after this section, unless there's any comments, is anyone expecting any other styles or looking to maybe discuss removing any of these from the book? Or we're comfortable with, this is essentially what they identified in the 70s in the Cape May Handbook and was replicated here. I'm probably going to condense the glossary. I added a lot of terms here. A couple of these I had not even heard of before, so I'll dial this back a little bit. These were combined from your ordinance, as I said, the Cape May Handbook, which introduced a lot of these exotic terms, and then also your 2002 standards, and I kind of conformed those and just took the most accurate definition. But this will be dialed back so it doesn't run for 4 pages.
We won't be tested on knowing.
Yeah, there'll be an assessment at the end of the.
So it particularly worries me if you have not heard of them.
Yeah, there's a couple good ones in here. Okay. And then after this, there's a resources page, federal, state, local, and then a bibliography of different reference things that we consulted, and then your typical acknowledgments. So, yeah, in our final couple minutes, I guess, if any summary comments or questions for the next round would be helpful.
No, I appreciate your time and effort, and the PIP and the committee's time and effort to put this together. This is part of the process. It is the first draft, and I think it's done very well. So I would congratulate you and the team, and look forward to our next meeting.
Are we planning on printing enough of these to make them readily available to anybody in the community, or?
There's a number in the grant.
Yeah, so I'm going to turn over 30, just like this soft cover bound, full color. And then you'll have a PDF, which you can run off copies of, or I'll even provide a link that you can get more from who's putting these together at cost. I think they're good.
And that whole thing, word for word, can go on the internet, too.
Yes, of course.
Another way to follow it.
Definitely going there.
Uh-huh.
And we're looking to get these, final draft in front of the commission fairly soon, like next month, so it can be approved and then continue on the process towards city council, because We really should not start the public outreach component of the project until it's fully adopted, so we don't confuse anyone.
Yeah.
Before we go to the public, does anyone else have a comment, observation?
I would just like to say, I was just saying to Mrs. Baldwin that the book is so much more inviting, so much less intimidating than the other. And I'm a teacher, and I know that certain people will gravitate towards certain things, and I think it's inviting, and I think that it is a step in getting what we want, which we do not want this to be such a formidable process for everyone. And I think that I want to especially thank Pip and John for a tremendous amount of work on this. But I just really love the book, and I think you've done a spectacular job. I really do. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Public? Yes, Harry?
Good evening. Harry Belandri, 511 Pearl Street, and also I am president and historian of the Greater Cape May Historical Society. Long time resident of Cape May and family in Cape May. And I have watched this process of historic preservation going all the way back to May 11, 1976, when, thanks to Carolyn Pitts, Cape May received its landmark designation. It was something the city did not want. They did everything they could to overturn it. We had an election. Bruce Minix was the winner, and the rest is history. You referred to the Book of Cape May. That was produced by Carolyn Pitts and her crew. Carolyn, Hugh McCauley, Trina Vaux McCauley, Mike Fish, and others put that book together. It was underwritten by Lannick Richfield and provided to every resident in Cape May. That was the first step in explaining to the populace what historic preservation means. It was not well understood. But we were coming from a thought process of urban renewal, or as some of us think, I think Tom will understand this one, urban removal, where the first thing to do is get rid of all these old buildings. We don't want them. Well over 70 were demolished before that was stopped. Fortunately, it was stopped. However, we did lose some valuable buildings. We have moved forward through the Cape May Handbook, the 20-year-old publication, to where we are today. And where we are today is presenting in a modern form how you maintain a historic district. And it is very important that we do. It's not been easy. It's not something that everyone wants to do. I have, believe it or not, the Historic Society, we get nasty letters about, well, it's your fault I can't put plastic windows in. No, we have gotten many of them. And wait a minute, no, it's not us. It's our friends across the street in City Hall. It's their fault.
That's great deflection on your part, Harry.
And believe me, they'll try to help you. Something very important coming out of this is going to be the access to information. It's been kind of hidden in these two books, which are anything but easy to wade through. Having my background in information technology, you're making it easy. Fortunately, the technology today presents that possibility. You can click on something and there's your picture, there's your description. Whereas here, you have to look at the book, try to find a page, it doesn't make any sense, and you don't know what to do. And the poor construction office is tearing their hair out. Whereas by leveraging the technology, you're going to make this a much simpler process. So I really have to commend you on taking this effort, and Stephen for his excellent work. He has met with the society to discuss this. And Maureen, you mentioned the availability of any pictures, documents, whatever the society might have. Of course, we will help and provide them. Thank you. And keep up the good work.
Other comments? Yes, please.
Hi, Laura Kalman. I was on City Council when the original, the 20-year, the 2002 happened, and I was a liaison, like you are, Lorraine, trying to create this document. And it's a long time coming. I'm so proud of all of you that it has happened. The format of it is going to be amazing with the hyperlinks that you're talking about. My concern is in the RFP, is there money to create this fantastic website? Because it is going to need a good amount of money. And seeing how there's a surplus in the budget this year, Lorraine, 12 million, I think the money is well spent so that we have that good website that we so deserve as the only National Historic Landmark District in the state of New Jersey that encompasses the whole municipality. And I think that should be also put into this document, along with the awards that Carolyn Pitts should have gotten from Cape May for the foresight for what we have here now. So can something be written about Carolyn and the team that came down and put in this? Because it is going to be our 50th year anniversary of surviving as a National Historic Landmark District in 2026. So we will all be celebrating it. So the question is, can anybody answer about the money for the website in the RFP?
That grant,
Yeah,
as far as the grant, the public outreach and the website.
And our meeting next month, which is not scheduled, we'll be going over exactly how the design elements of the website and the way the access will be. And I believe there is sufficient funds available to bring this to life. So I would expect it to be.
So that it can be easily accessed, like people over there in Jackson Street who are
Yes.
new to this.
It's part of the grant. The whole point of this was to update not just the standards, but the communication and the training of all the applicants. So yes, there'll be a website. It'll be easy to access. And in fact, the design idea that is presented is while it will be part of the Cape May website, it'll be an independent, and that you can
Right.
you'll be able to access Cape May city design standards, and it will come to life. So you won't have to plow around.
So are you going to have to hire somebody to create this website? Because I know there's no IT person in Cape May City
Yes.
employee
We-
that can do this.
Yes, we do have a few people that are pretty tech savvy, but we also have a hired IT.
Okay, because we're talking hyperlink. We're talking about trying to.
Well, the hyperlinks are all going to come as part of what you're doing. So it really it comes to a point where we're uploading the document that you have onto our website and making sure that it's, it's easy.
Because the problem you might have is connecting with that federal link.
It'll be automatically hyperlinked. Yeah.
Because they have a
To the link today,
different-
which just changed 6 months ago. So a standard that I wrote 18 months ago, the hyperlinks are just going to the homepage of the federal standards now, but they'll be hyperlinked. The website, you'll be able to update fairly easily. And
Okay.
what I'm providing as part of this project is what's called a wireframe of the new website. So taking the existing 2-page website that you have, there's like a main landing page for the HPC and then frequently asked questions, and expanding that to 5 or 6 different sections covering, of course, the design standards, application materials, resources, potentially the history of the standards, I think would be an important one to have, starting with the 72, is that correct? Cape May Handbook document.
After 76.
Sorry, 76, a couple of years before I was born. Handbook document, and then also addressing, this 2002 standards, Cape May being one of the first, towns in New Jersey to adopt these, and then the current incarnation. Yeah, that
Okay.
could all be included.
Great. So Pip, thank you. John, thank you for all the work that you've done, and the rest of the commission.
Thanks.
Okay?
Many people have worked.
Thank you.
Just to mention, there's also that third component, which is the community outreach, which cannot be understated.
As we work real hard to make sure we're moving into the future of this, sometimes I think it's really great to look around this room and remember that Carolyn Pitts and her group of architects, the Historic American Building Survey, picked out the most important buildings in town and did architectural drawings, and many of them were in pretty poor shape at that period of time. And here we are 50 years later. Every one of them is still here. Most of them are in good shape. Many of them have new, useful uses to them that are helping them to be preserved. And I bet you couldn't find many other towns in America that could ever take a 50-year period and say every one of our landmarks is still here, including Washington.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. And if you have any other comments that came to mind or markups you'd like to add to the text, please try and do that this week so that I can incorporate those into the next iteration.
Terrific.
Thanks.
Going to declare the meeting adjourned.
The meeting is adjourned.
All right, thank you.